The enslavement of FBA in USA. Yes, today we're going to discuss the enslavement of foundational Black Americans. This is the video, and this video is about foundational Black American history. We are here to learn our history, and I, Dr. Clyde Winters, I'm here to teach you about our history. I want you to know and I want you to understand what a great history we have. You can find out more about the various histories of foundational Black Americans in my book, History of Blacks in America from Prehistory to 1876. This is a very interesting and good book because what it does is that it corresponds to much of the material that you're going to be learning over the next few videos related to our ancient history or our foundational Black American history. My second book, The Phylogeography of Afro-Americans and Africans. This book is a very important book, and it's a book that you should always have in your library. And the reason that you need to have this in your library is because the fact is that this is the book that can help you to understand our genetic history. You know, what are the genes that we carry? What are the genes that Black people carry? How do we spread these genes around the world? You're going to find that information in my book, The Phylogeography of Afro-Americans and Africans. And in my book, we are not just Africans, the Black Native Americans. This is a very important book because we've been brainwashed. Yes, brainwashed. We've been taught that the history of the Black people in the United States, the Black people in the Americas, foundational Black Americans, is basically a history of African people who were kidnapped from Africa and brought to the United States to work on the plantations. This is not always true, you see. My other books about is Atlantis in Mexico, African Empires in Ancient America. All of these books are going to tell you about our history. It'll let you know what we've done. It'll let you know the information that can help you to get a greater understanding of who and what you are, family. The Mandi in the ancient Americas is about the various Mandi groups that came to the Americas, and also the Black mound builders are very important. You know, when we think about slavery, Henry Wadsworth, he wrote a very important poem. Beside the ungathered rice he lay, his sickle in his hand, his breast was bare, his matted hair was buried in the sand. And then he says, and then at furious speed he rode along the Niger banks. You know, when you think about, in a sense, the triangle of trade, it's very important to understand that the triangle of trade was a trade in which New Englanders traded extensively, you know, their rum, well-oiled furs, and rum to people in the Caribbean and Africa. However, one distinct route was formed was the triangle of trade. This pattern occurred as follows. New Englanders would manufacture the goods. They would take these goods to Africa, and the slaves were taken on the Middle Passage to the West Indies, where they were sold for molasses and money. Other slaves were taken directly to the United States. The molasses would be sent to New England to make rum and start the entire system of trade all over again. It is important to note that the triangle of trade was not an official or rigid system of trade, but instead a name that has been given to its triangular route of trade that existed between three places across the Atlantic. Further, other triangle-shaped trade routes existed at this time. However, when individuals speak of the triangle of trade, they are typically referring to this system. When we look at the spread of slavery, we see that slaves came from West Africa. Although they came from Western Africa, the spread of slaves in the United States kind of had various periods. For example, up to 1790, most of the slaves were in the North. They were mainly slaves in New York City and all the way into New England. But then we find that about 1810, the slaves began to be most populous, not in the North, but they began, in a sense, to dominate the South. They began to dominate places like North Carolina, South Carolina. And then by 1830, we see that the slave trade had expanded even into the lower South, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and as far as Texas. So we can see that this spread of slavery was a way in which, in a sense, they were able to put enslaved foundational Black Americans across the United States and put them in the various areas. And this is important to understand because, see, there were millions of Black slaves, but many of these slaves, you had to remember, were not just Africans. Many of these slaves were also, in a sense, black Indians. Slavery in the North and South was different. Slaves in the North often lived in their master's residence. Slaves often moved around cities and towns freely with a pass. The soil in the North was rocky, so they didn't have too much farming. So it was a large white population, and most people worked in manufacturing and skilled trades. Slavery in the South, on the other hand, was a little bit different. They had large numbers of slaves to work the plantations. Slaves usually lived in separate cabins. Slaves had a little contact with outside peers of plantation. They tried to keep the plantations away from the populous areas. It was rich farmland, a small white population, and they cultivated cash crops. This is very important to understand that slavery in the South was made lucrative because of the fact that it was a favorable climate for agriculture, and they could keep the slaves working year round. In the North, slavery after a while was not so economically viable for them because of the fact, in a sense, that they felt that it was cheaper to have people work for them and they could pay them wages that were just about as bad as being a slave. So as you can imagine, slavery in the North and slavery in the South were two different, but it's important to remember that slavery was throughout the United States. Slavery was not just in the South, but many people, they don't know this. Many people aren't aware of the fact that slavery was spread throughout the United States. And because slavery was spread throughout the United States, there was slavery in the North just like there was slavery in the South. This is something we must remember, something we need to know. Enslaved foundation of Black American culture. Slaves developed their own culture. In relation to dance, while in Africa, men and women danced separately, in America, Africans learned to add leg movements to their dances, and men and women danced together. The drum remained the main instrument of Afro-American dance. The master taught the slave to believe that God wanted them to be a slave. They learned that the only slaves going to heaven were obedient to their masters. In the master's church, the services lacked emotion. The people seemed stiff and services were boring. Blacks were not permitted to sit on the main floor with whites. The slave religion was different. It was an emotional religion. The African slaves called their religious places praise houses. It was the center of people's lives. The singing at the praise house was the center of Black spiritualism. The music and dance made God come alive inside the individual foundation of Black American. During the religious services, the believers were in constant motion, and the services included singing, swaying, speaking in tongues, dance, and music. It was a place where people could experience joy, people could experience exhilaration. Masters did not allow slaves to have their own services. They were supposed to be guided by white ministers. As a result, the slave church services were held in secret in the forest or in a slave's cabin. Slaves believed that church should be an active place where the believer worshiped God in various ways. They believed in the God of Israel, not Jesus. Yes, they believed in Jehovah, Yahweh. It was in the church that Afro-Americans developed a fine oral literature and songs praying for their freedom. FBA Slave Life. The slaves worked from sunup to sundown. They lived in cabins, they grew their own food, and gathered greens in the woods or forest near the plantation. Slaves worked every day but Sunday. The master provided standard rations to the slaves. The standard rations were cornmeal, salt pork, or bacon. In relation to the way slaves dressed, the children usually went around nude. Yes, they were, in movies they always had slave children dressed. This wasn't really true. The slave hands were provided one outfit per year. You had one outfit of clothes to wear a year, so you can imagine how that's impacted on us, and that's one of the reasons why today Black Foundation of Black Americans are so interested in wearing the most trendy clothes. Slave marriages were not recognized. Masters determined who you would marry or mate. Children were the possession of the master. Husbands had no control over his wife, who could be raped by any white who desired to do so, if he had the permission of the slave master. Slave families were very fragile. It was common to divide slave families. Often husbands and wives may be owned by different masters. Prior to 1790, slave families might be kept together. This ended with the rise of the interstate slave trade. During the interstate slave trade, one could experience 11.4 sales of a member of their family. Masters usually kept the young children and sold the women. At this time, 70% of women were sold involuntarily from their husbands. Some researchers estimate that as many as 4,300 slave marriages were broken up each year. Yes. But there were also slave rebellions. Black people rebelled They had insurrection. The first African rebellion was in South Carolina. This was the Stone Revolt of 1739. Slaves attacked a fort and killed 20 whites. Slaves who ran away often established their own communities where they set up their own governments. These communities were called maroon communities. Many slaves of the Spanish and later the English established maroon communities throughout the South, especially Florida. The most famous slave revolt was the Nat Turner Revolt. Nat Turner was born in 1800 on the plantation of Benjamin Turner at Southampton County, Virginia. His parents taught him to read and write. They told him that he had a unique destiny. Turner was deeply religious. He often prayed and fasted. After one fast, he says God told him to run away. He returned after 30 days. Later, he got a revelation from God to lead a slave revolt. He gathered followers and began a revolt with killing his master. He and his lieutenants killed 55 whites before he was captured. It was after Nat Turner that blacks were no longer allowed to have their own church services. During the Revolutionary War, many black people served. Many blacks fought on the side of the British. Some of these blacks were former slaves. For example, 2,500 blacks fled their masters in South Carolina, and some joined the British. 2,000 slaves, including slaves owned by George Washington, yes, George Washington, joined General Cornwallis to help fight the Americans. Blacks armed by the British harassed and slaughtered their masters and their families in Savannah, Georgia. Yes, they were not afraid to fight or to die. These blacks were known as the King of England soldiers. In New York, a strong garrison of blacks known as the Negro Fort held off their former masters for years. 200 blacks fought against the Americans at the Battle for Long Island. The participation of blacks in the Revolutionary War spread fear throughout the South. White Americans became afraid that slaves would attack them. Blacks fought for the British because on November 7, 1775, John Murray Dunmore freed the slaves because of the actions of the Americans. As a result of the revolt, Dunmore declared martial law, and that all indentured servants, Negroes, and others free that were willing to bear arms should join His Majesty's troops. Dunmore devised a plan to get slave soldiers. He often attacked plantations in Virginia, and he would recruit slaves to serve as soldiers. Only free blacks or blacks fighting in place of their masters could serve in the American army. So you can see that it was more advantageous for those black people who were enslaved, those foundational black Americans. It was better for them to fight with the British than to fight with the Americans. During the FBA Revolutionary War, soldiers from the slave plantations wore the emblem liberty to slaves across their chests. They served as pilots, sailors, and infantrymen. Some researchers claim that while 5,000 blacks fought with the Americans, 20,000 FBA served in the British military. Only slaves of the Americans seeking freedom from British rule were freed. Loyal subjects were allowed to keep their slaves. The British honored the contract they made with the slaves. As a result, when the British lost an area, they always took the slaves with them during a retreat. At the end of the war, around 25,000 former FBAs left with the British after the Revolutionary War. The sick and aged slaves were left in the United States. Loyalist slave masters sold their slaves to the Americans to gain the resources to leave America to escape retaliation at the hands of the Americans who had won the war. The plantations were organized in different ways. On plantation with less than 6 slaves, the master usually worked with the slaves in the field. On larger plantations, you had the master and overseer. The master gave the overseer orders. He determined the punishment for slaves and provided the leadership to the plantation. The overseer had a variety of jobs. He obeyed all instructions of the master and he kept watch over the slaves. He had to make sure all the work was done and supervise the drivers and field slaves. The drivers were usually slaves who would supervise teams of slaves working in the field. Slaves were divided into field hands and house slaves. The field hands picked cotton, hoed the fields, and fed cows. Other slaves worked as blacksmiths or performed other crafts on a plantation. Very important to remember that everything that had to be done on a plantation, wheelwright, blacksmith, architect, bricklayer, fence builder, these are jobs all done by the slaves. The house slaves also had specific duties. They're responsible for cooking and cleaning the house. They were also supposed to serve the master in any capacity they required and spy on the other slaves to keep the master informed in case the slaves wanted to have a rebellion or the slaves wanted to run away. During slavery, many slaves worked on farms besides their masters. But as tobacco, rice, and cotton became valuable items of trade, Most African slaves worked on large plantations. Slaves worked from sunup to sundown. Before the sun rose, slaves usually began preparing their meals for that day. In the evening, they would hunt game and collect greens to cook for their dinner the next day. The plantations were organized into a gang system. Field hands were divided into small groups of workers, commanded by a driver. Each slave was assigned a task. This task was a specific daily job the slave would complete. Very important to understand that these slave plantations were well organized. These Europeans who owned the slaves were out to make money, and they made plenty. The labor was well organized. Everyone worked from children aged 5 on up to old age. The old people and children 5 and older were recognized as corner hands. A slave's age determined his her duties. A 5 to 10-year-old, they were called water toters. They took the water to the fields and kept the farm workers, with their water. From the ages of 10 to 12, you were called a fractional hand. From 12 to 17, you were a half hand. 18 and older, you were considered a full hand. Old slaves cooked, cleaned up the area, or cared for their children. Half hands were those slaves who were breeding women or sucklers. The only task of breeding women was produce children. Yes, they were just like today we take pit bulls around and other dogs and have them mate. And just think about that they made some women just be breeding women. These women, as you might imagine, many of them didn't live that long because having all those babies, it wasn't a good thing for them. The only task of breeding one was produce children. This wasn't really good. Older children were organized into trash gangs or squads to pull weeds. This gives you a summary of how it was for the enslaved African. We're going to discuss other parts of FBA history, but right now we're going to begin with this whole idea of understanding how slavery existed and what people did at that time. Thank you.